I'm Michael Eury, editor of Back Issue magazine, and you're watching Mr. Media.
I'm Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview. You can see, hear, and read more than 1,000 of my previous celebrity interviews at mrmedia.com. That's mrmedia.com. Subscribe to the show on YouTube, iTunes, Apple Podcast, Apple News, Google Play, Mixcloud, Spreaker, or Stitcher, and follow me on Twitter and Facebook. On today's show, I'll welcome Michael Eury, editor of the comic book fanzine Back Issue. It just published its 100th issue, focusing on Bronze Age fanzines and fandom, which was my four-color era. He's also the author of Hero a Go-Go, Comic Books, Crime Fighters, and Culture of the Swinging 60s. And this is his second time on Mr. Media. Stick around. My name is Bob, and I edited a fanzine, or two, in the 1970s.
Hi, Bob.
Today, I'm a modestly successful writer, and I can draw a straight line back to comic book fanzines as early supporters of my career ambition. The only thing I ever really wanted to grow up and do was write, and low-budget, work-for-free fanzines of the 1970s were my ticket to all the experience I could want. At one point, I was contributing to more than a dozen zines, reviews, interviews, and opinion pieces, most of which I hope never find their way back to the public domain. Reading the grand 100th issue of Michael Eury's Back Issue magazine was a thrill for me, recapturing the fan scene and the zine scene of my teen years, and filling in many gaps in my knowledge of the Comics Buyer's Guide, to which I contributed a monthly column called Jersey Scene on behalf of the fans of Central Jersey Comics Collectors Club, which is not mentioned in this issue at all. Also mentions Foom, Squatron, Amazing World of DC Comics, Charlton Bullseye, and much more. The special issue also gives us an insider's view of Back Issue itself, thanks to previous Mr. Media guest Bob Greenberger's interview with editor Michael Eury, today's guest. This is Michael's second visit to Mr. Media. He was here earlier this year to talk about his new book, Hero a Go-Go, Campy Comic Books, Crime Fighters, and Culture of the Swinging 60s. Michael Eury, welcome back to Mr. Media.
Glad to be here, Bob. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for playing along with our AA-like introduction. There have been more than a few strolls down comic book fandom and fanzine memory lane in recent years, but personally I found this issue of Back Issue to be absolutely captivating, and I just want to say at the top, thank you very much, because I got a lot of entertainment out of it.
Well, great. Well, you're very welcome. I did too, and I learned a lot from it as well.
Well, it's funny you said that, because I wanted to ask you about that. Did you find, as long as you've been involved in comics and fandom, did you find that there were still things that you did not know? Which I found. I mean,
Oh, heck yeah. I mean, particularly with John Wells's article about the comic reader and sort of the growth of fanzines as a whole. He ran that by Paul Levitz. He vetted it through Paul, and Paul even said, I've learned some things from your article, and Paul's a pretty, well-informed person who was one of the fundamental figures, as you're very much aware, of fanzines of the 70s as well. So, there was just a lot to learn, a lot to absorb in that issue. I've been getting a lot of good mail just this week, as a matter of fact, a couple of letters a day, emails a day about it. And people are just like you. They are they're thrilled by the issue. They're learning a lot from it.
I'm always fascinated. I mean, and the story captured it really well. The Comic Buyer's Guide, Alan Light's fanzine. When I was a teenager, I would wait by the mailbox on the day that it was due, whether it was Wednesday or Thursday. I couldn't wait for it to come. You got that thick. It was like this thick, packed with ads, articles. It had so much stuff. You knew what was going on. It was updated weekly, which was unlike anything else, pro or fanzine related. And I'm always fascinated to read, Alan's story. It's such a simple story. It's one of those entrepreneurial things where he saw an opening and he rammed a Mack truck through it.
He did indeed, didn't he? And he took us along for the ride. And I was like you. I waited by the mailbox. I was excited to get a CBG or TBG, whatever, during its different stages of its growth. But as you know, here we are, speaking through the miracle of the internet. But of course, 40 years ago, I mean, this was maybe in development by a handful of computer geeks, but we had no such tool to disperse information and communicate. And print publications like that one were just about the only vehicle a comics fan had to learn about comics history as well as upcoming comics. So it was pretty darn exciting. And plus, with the buyer's guide, you could always go through the ads in the back too and start to fill in gaps in your collection, which I did. I remember, as a matter of fact, that maybe the very first comic that I ordered, back issue comic I ordered, was through the buyer's guide, and it was the Spectre #7.
Wow, what a memory.
I remember getting that in the mail. Yeah, I was pretty excited about that.
I think the two things, well, a couple things. So one of the things about doing a column for the buyer's guide, and you correct me, under Allen was it the buyer's guide, and then under the Maggie Thompson it was comic buyer's guide, or am I getting it backwards?
The original name is the Buyer's Guide for Comic Fandom. That's it. So the Buyer's Guide.
Okay.
Yeah, since it changed names, and that's a tongue twister too. But yeah.
Well, so I remember doing the thing that I did, and you could have as much space, I think, as you wanted. The thing was, you had to lay it out at home and then mail it to Allen flat. So the page, you had to lay out the entire thing so that the pages, like whatever I wrote, whatever I contributed, was done on my typewriter, which probably had a different font than, say, Maggie Thompson's typewriter, or Tony. I think Tony Isabella wrote for them, or maybe, or no, he was a pro at the time, so he didn't, but other people who did. So all the pages look different. And I remember having Mark Chiarello, who's the art director for DC Comics now. He and I grew up a few minutes away from each other. I was in North Brunswick, New Jersey. He was in Jamesburg. We never met physically, but he would mail me these little spot illustrations that I would drop in to the Jersey Scene column, and I'd have to use rubber cement, and I'd paste it down, and it was always such a thrill to see it in print. And then the other thing for me about the Buyer's Guide was, and I may have mentioned this to you the last time we spoke, but I met Murray Bischoff, who was the news editor for it. I met him at a Creation comic convention in the 70s in New York. I don't know if I was working for a comics dealer then or if I was there as a fan, because I know I did both at different conventions. But I met him, and today it would freak me out if my kid went through this experience, because I met Murray and we started talking, and I think he was the one who eventually opened the door for me to do that column, but we met, and he was telling me that he was getting ready to leave the show and he was going to go haunt old art galleries looking for Maxfield Parrish prints. And I was like, I didn't know who that was. He said, you want to come with me? And I'm like, okay. I didn't tell anybody. My mother barely knew I was in New York. I mean, and here I'm going off with this guy from the Midwest I've never met, I don't know, except that I've seen his name in the Buyer's Guide. And so we went, I don't know how many places we went that day, but we went to all these basements of art galleries and stuff, and he turned me on to Maxfield Parrish. I have, somewhere in the house, a Maxfield Parrish lithograph that I got, I don't know, 5 or 10 years later when I got my first apartment. It was the first piece of art that I bought for my apartment, and it was because of Murray Bischoff. The last part of the story, and then you'll get plenty of time to talk, but the last part of the story was about 2 or 3 years ago, I ran across his name, I don't know, on a clip or something, and I thought, I wonder what happened to him. And I went on Facebook, and as a lot of us do, I looked up Murray Bischoff, and there he was.
Okay.
My mind was blown, and I sent him a note, and I said, I'm sure you don't remember me, but blah, 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 blah. And thank you very much. So, I think we're friends on Facebook. I never hear from him, but other than, he acknowledged that. But it was very important in a social way to me, the contacts that I made through fandom and fanzines. And so, long story to get to this point, that was part of the reason why this issue was just so meaningful to me personally.
Oh, understood. And that's a great story. It's not unlike what I experienced with APAs, Amateur Press Alliances, which of course were individual fanzines that people would do under an umbrella editorial title. I was in Interlac, the Legion of Superheroes one for a while. I was in one called Cartoon Appa, and also Caroline Appa. Yeah, we had one in North Carolina, a regional one that went for a year or two. And so I know what you're talking about. You had different fonts throughout the magazine. Pay stuff that you would do by hand, and very, very primitive, but very fun. And a great way to connect with fandom and the material.
And there's so many guys, and you kind of pointed that. Paul Levitz is a guy who came up through the fanzines. Bob Layton came up through fanzine
Absolutely.
type of work. You had artists, you had writers. John Byrne, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not putting myself at all in that class or your class, frankly. You guys all worked at at the publishing companies and had these careers that the people who were fans would just kill for and love hearing about. But it really was, and I don't know if I don't know if it's the same kind of elevator to publication today that it was then when it was the Wild Wild West in terms of publishing. But it was an amazing time, I thought.
Yeah, it was. And I wonder today, that's a good point. The guys who blog about comics, for example, are they the next wave of editors and writers and artists? Because again, it was a gateway for me. One fanzine that I wanted to include in issue 100 that we just flat out did not have space for was Amazing Heroes.
Oh,
And that's
yeah.
I started. I was with Bannock Graphics, and Mark Wade was the editor of Amazing Heroes. And interestingly, I had met Mark. I don't think I'd ever met him face to face yet, but I knew him through Interlac. And then he became the editor of Amazing Heroes, and he gave me my first gig there. And that ultimately paved the way for me to get into comic books as an editor, because I was doing a lot of reviews and starting to get to know people who were editors and writers and artists for DC and Marvel, because Amazing Heroes was known for doing all of those preview specials too, which were about the only way you could really find out about what was coming up in comics. But Amazing Heroes will eventually be covered in back issue, but it kind of brought up the rear chronologically, and something had to go. Something had to go. I had somebody ask me the other day too, what about Marvel's pizzazz? And again, well, there are probably a few other fanzines and magazines of that era that could have been covered chronologically, but you've only got so many pages. And with this one, we had 100 pages. Normally we're an 80-page magazine, but we had extra pages this time out, given its centennial nature. But still, at the end of the day, just per square inch of paper, we probably have more words there than you can find in any other comics-related publication out. It's a very dense but wonderful read.
It's a lot of fun, and I think after the fanzine stuff, the buyer's guide stuff, and the comics reader stuff, the piece on Foom, breaking it down issue by issue, had to be my next favorite thing, because I don't know what it was. I just adored that magazine. It made me feel like I was getting. It was quarterly, as I recall, and you were getting kind of like the Marvel Bullpen's bulletin, supersized by a factor of whatever number of pages there were. Because if you enjoyed the Bullpen bulletins every comic every month with the comics, here you're getting all that detail that you just didn't get, and the art was great. I mean, my favorite is still that Thing cover where he's like up on the building. And I'm probably not describing it well, but am I overreacting to that, or was that interesting for you or other people as well?
Well, it was interesting to me, but I think that maybe part of your perspective is maybe shaped by the comics you appreciated when you were at an impressionable age. For me, it was I wrote the Amazing World of DC article in the issue, and I connected with that magazine when it was coming out the same way you did with Foom, even though I did read Foom. But I've always been more of a DC than a Marvel reader, and so my allegiance was toward Amazing World, and I wouldn't let anybody else have that assignment for this issue. Occasionally, I do claim executive privilege. Normally, when I announce a theme among my writers group, usually the articles are fair game and people can pitch. and the best proposal wins. Occasionally, I do go to a specific person who has shown that he or she is an expert in a certain field. John Wells, the one on the comics reader, I just knew that he had done the research. He had the collection. That nobody pitched for that. I just assigned that to him flat out. But again, with Amazing World, that was just something I was passionate about, so I grabbed that one for myself. But yeah, there were a number of pitches for the Foom, and the one that you read, Stefan Fried, he did a fabulous job, and he was very passionate about it, and had a good time contacting the people involved for their perspectives.
Oh, I bet. I did not realize or didn't remember that Tony Isabella had edited a few issues. Tony, I met Tony briefly in that same period. He was a guest at a comic book show that the Fans of Central Jersey put on, and my friend Bob Pinaha, who later worked at DC, and I think you know, had arranged for Tony to fly in, I guess, from Ohio to do this convention. And I went with Bob in his Pinto, his little brown Pinto, which I later learned to drive in that car. But anyway, we picked Tony up at Newark International Airport, and I'm sitting in the back, and I'm just like, Bob and Tony are just talking, and I just can't believe I'm eavesdropping on these guys. And then I had forgotten that Tony had been an editor of that. And by the way, you were correct. I'm more of a Marvel guy than a DC guy, so. Well, I have it. I had bought all those DC Amazing World of DC Comics issues. Not as excited by them as I was by Foom.
Yeah. Oh, and that's a good thing about back issue and having the format that we have. We can explore a lot of different material, and hopefully it's presented in a way that is interesting for people. I do routinely get comments from people saying that I had no interest in subject A or subject B until I read this article, and then it fascinated me, and I'm constantly being told that we send people to the back issue bins of comic shops, or scouring eBay trying to find books that they've read about in back issue, or something they used to have in their collection that either mom threw out or they sold years later. But I think we need to get a cut of back issue sales from a lot of the major retailers across the country, because I think that magazine has actually goosed some of their sales up.
Listen, if you can do it, do it.
Yeah, right. I'm not going to hold my breath on that.
You figure out a way to do that one, please go right ahead. In the same way, Charlton comics were always very inconsistent and very hard to find at the newsstand. And I remember I would come upon an out-of-the-way newsstand that had like a bunch of Charltons, and there would be months worth, and I would pick them up. I seem to recall the Charlton Bullseye, Charlton Portfolio the same kind of way, in that I don't remember seeing them, unless I was at a convention somewhere, I don't remember seeing them consistently, but I do remember that I would be somewhere and they would have a bunch of them, and I would buy them and read them. And what was interesting there is, because of the absurdities of how Charlton was published, and I'd refer people to the story to learn more about that. It's a really interesting story years later to read about how things came together or didn't come together at Charlton, and how see common agreement about how crappy their printing presses were, but the talent that they attracted was always amazing.
Well, it was a good training ground for some new people, like Bob Layton and John Byrne, and additionally too, Steve Ditko, left Marvel and DC and went back to Charlton. There, he popped in a few times too, because he got a little more creative, freedom, I think, than he did when he was working for those different times for the big two. Even though he got a lower page rate, my mentor at DC Comics was Dick Giordano, who, of course, famously was the managing editor at Charlton before he went to DC in the late 60s. And, he by his own admission, Charlton had the crappiest rates of any of the publishers, at least in the New York metro area, which pretty much that were all the publishers were there in the New York metro area. Back in those days, and the era we cover in this issue of Back Issue, if you wanted to break into comics, if you did not live in that region, you had to, like in my case, as a kid who grew up in North Carolina, you had to go north. You had to settle there and penetrate the market. And, our comics history is filled with stories of all these artists who went up there and became roommates and had studios together and such. And, some who would sleep on the floors of somebody's studio until they got acclimated and got enough gigs to afford rent of their own and that type of thing. So there was just this primal nature to it all back then. There was just intimate and fun and cool. And I think through the fanzine issue here and the fandom issue, I think we've rekindled a lot of that.
Was it? Did you ever think twice about making this the 100th issue, this particular theme? Was there anything else that you had considered?
No, actually, I had this in mind for a couple of years, just thinking ahead. And I do plan ahead. I mean, I've already got the next couple of years worth of issues planned out, and then just various notes in a file. Like if I think of a potential theme, and occasionally somebody will suggest one, like on the Facebook group that we have at Back Issue. Every now and then somebody's suggesting, what about blah, blah, blah as an idea for a theme? And, yeah, that's a great idea. And in those cases, when somebody does that, I give them an acknowledgement in the magazine. We send them a comp as a thank you for their creativity. But this is just something that I felt we needed to do and would be a fun theme. And it's funny that when I mentioned it to our publisher a couple of years back, John Morrow, I had to explain it to him before he got it, because I said, Bronze Age fandom and fanzines, and he kind of went, huh? And then, when I told him about what it was going to be, he said, oh yeah, and then it really just turned out to be a sweet issue. I'm very happy with it.
That's good.
And the cover too, with the giant 100. I mean, there it is. Which of course has the miniature versions of every cover from number 1 through 99. Right there, Michael Cronenberg did that very beautifully, and I suggested to him, let's just do a big blocky 100 and fill it in with miniature versions of the covers, and he did it wonderfully.
I was going to say, right before you named John by name, I was going to say, I pity the poor bastard who had to do that job, because it looks great, but it had to be a major pain in the butt.
Oh yeah, he did a great job. Yeah, but I'm sure it was like a big jigsaw puzzle just to fit those pieces in together. But again, they're all chronological too, so works fine.
It's got to be hard. There was another story I found interesting, was the Robert Overstreet story.
Oh yeah.
There's been more written about him in recent years. We never really knew much about him in the early years of the guide. That was really interesting. Was he at all resistant to that kind of attention and that kind of focus on him rather than the guide, or did he play along pretty well?
He played along very well. That was done through J.C. Bond, who was vice president of publishing at Gemstone. He did the interview, and so he works with Bob closely. And so I think when you've got some camaraderie between interviewer and interviewee, you'll often get a better dialogue, because there's a comfort zone that the two share, and also the interviewer really needs to be fluent in the language of and the history of the publication in this case, and Jeff Vaughn was, so he knew what to ask and knew how to steer Bob along, but Bob really didn't need coaxing. He was very forthcoming with information, and to me it was fascinating too, because the Overstreet Price Guide is one of these things that those of us who've kind of grown up with this over the past 40-something years, and you've always consulted it. I remember when I was much younger and the publication was fresh, I would flip through and look at the miniature versions of these old covers and just imagine what it would be like to actually see one. And that story was fascinating too, and I'm honored for that and Alan Light's story in particular. They're just so integral to the comics fandom and movement over the years that it's just, wow, what a great honor to have included them in this issue.
Now, I know a lot of people turn to you as the guy who decides what's Bronze Age and what's not as a result of the magazine, which got me wondering just a minute ago, where does Diamond Distributors come in? And Steve, and I can never remember because I never hear it out loud. Is it Geppy or Jeppy?
It's Jeppy.
Jeppy.
Yeah.
Does he come in at the end of the Bronze Age, during the Bronze Age? When?
Oh, well, I haven't really thought about it, and I have to admit I haven't fully researched. I mean, I'm guessing he'd come in at the end of the Bronze Age, and at the end, the Bronze Age dates are a little
Fluid.
left up in the air. I mean, you can. I think it used to be, as far as Overstreet, to go back to that, is concerned, they were just pretty much 1970 through 1980, and then 1980 began the modern age. But my argument today here in 2017 that there's nothing modern about 1980. That really goes back a stretch. And as each, additional, crow's feet or whatever I get reminds me when I look in the mirror and shave in the morning. But nonetheless, I think now it's kind of like the mid 80s are sort of considered to be the end of the Bronze Age, because that's when you had Secret Wars and Crisis. And so those series were sort of the end of the grand old type of storytelling as you still saw through the 70s. To me, though, back issue, we have the best realm to explore. And I mean, no disrespect to Roy Thomas with the Golden and Silver Age, but I really find that the 70s and 80s were the decades of just, energy and revitalization of comic books. And also the medium itself as an art form really started to grow just beyond, say, a blocky 6-panel grid on a page, and even that started really actually, to give the two guys their props, with Steranko and Adams in the late 60s and the late Silver Age, when these guys really started to break up the traditional storytelling, and occasionally it got a little wonky. I remember being a small kid looking at those books and trying to figure out how to read it, but now as a not so small kid, I go back and say, wow, these guys were revolutionary. But even some of the stuff that was transpiring during the 70s, you had artists like, Kaluta and Wrightson, who were doing things that were just, eye candy beautiful to look at, but also, dynamic storytelling, but they would take their chances with how to lay out a page or something, or in Wrightson's case, I mean, those dynamite, title pages that he would do for House of Mystery and the other DC horror books were just, beautifully rendered and, ghastly, but the kind of ghastly where you want to look, not look away.
Right.
Fabulous stuff. Fabulous stuff. What a great era that was, and that's what shaped me as a kid, and then later adolescent, growing up reading that stuff. And so now I'm charged with helping capture its history. And so, wow, what a cool job.
It is a cool job.
Yeah, it is a cool job.
I laughed a little while ago. You mentioned about when you get the new issue of the Overstreet Guide and you want to go through and look at those little postage stamp covers, and I laughed because I thought, I can't remember when I had enough time in the day to do something that would be that much fun. Did that era really exist, that I had time to go through the Overstreet Guide page by page and look at the covers and look up some of the prices for some of the books that I had? Did that really happen? It seems like it was so long ago.
Well, those are good memories, though, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
I can't try to do that now. I mean, even if I were trying to do that, I generally read in bed. So I've learned that I can't read thick books because I fall asleep. And I a couple of years back, I was reading something like the Absolute Kingdom Come, or one of those giant, like 80-pound books. I was holding it up like this, and I'm starting to get fatigued, and I literally fall asleep, and it smacks me upside the head, wakes me up. I know it wakes my wife up, and I luckily I didn't break my nose, so I tend to read soft cover, very light things in bed, because inevitably it's going to end up in my face and tell me that it's time to turn the light off and go to sleep.
I keep thinking, about a year ago at one of the local comic shops, Emerald City here in Clearwater, St. Pete, I bought for half price the Howard the Duck hardcover treasury of every Howard appearance. It's a fabulous book. It's still in the plastic because as much as I want to read it, as much as I loved Howard, I just can't find the time to open the book and start reading it, because I'm afraid if I start reading it, I won't put it down, and like something important that would like a book that I'm writing as opposed to what I want to read will not get done.
Well, these big omnibus editions and things that people do today too, they're wonderful to have from an archival perspective. but they're also kind of difficult to read because they're so big and heavy.
Mm. When I did the Eisner biography years ago, he gave me the entire DC set of Treasuries of the Spirit,
Oh,
and I had the excuse then, to my wife's frustration, I had the excuse that I had to read from beginning to end. So I think it was 17 volumes then. I think there was an 18th or 19th volume that they did with Dark Horse later of the New Adventures. But it was an excuse, and I can't remember since then having the time to sit down and read like that. And I maybe one day. Anyway, coming back to back issue.
yeah, we did digress, didn't we?
Yeah, it was fun though. What was it like being interviewed about your own magazine by Bob Greenberger?
It was Bob actually asked if he could do that a few years ago. Issue, I think it was number 69, was our 10th anniversary issue, and he said, "Well, why don't we do an interview with you as editor?" And I said, let's just hold off on that. And I'm glad that I did, because at this point, 14 years of the magazine under my belt, there was just more of a story to tell. It was fun, and I worked with Bob back in the day at DC, and so I've known him for a long time. I communicated with him before I actually was hired by DC, and so that was fun. I had not spoken with him on the phone in a while, so we had a great chat. And I'm rarely asked about this or my career, and I've had ups and downs with my career, and some of the downs were by my own making. And now that I'm 60 years old, and I can look back and take stock in this, like I said, I think I even used this phrase in my interview that I'm comfortable in my skin now, which means I can admit my failures as well as my successes. And we talked about some of those in the interview, and it was fun. And also I was able to provide some perspective for readers on the editorial process of back issue. I mean, one thing I'd like to emphasize that I am so sorry. I should have killed that before.
Incoming.
Incoming. Duck! Duck!
Yeah, and I have a phone that talks to me. And, oh, that's embarrassing. All right, be quiet.
All right.
Okay. Sorry about that. It will stop in a
It
minute.
will. Not a problem. We all have phones.
That's the one precaution I didn't take today. So now you got
right.
Here you are. With back issue, we don't work from an editorial office. Tomorrow's Publications does have an office, but everyone who produces magazines and or books for Tomorrow's works from their satellite location. And so I work from my home office here in Concord, North Carolina. And so my designer, the interior designer for back issue, is in Vancouver, Washington. And he and I worked together when I lived in Portland, Oregon. We were friends. We go back a ways. The cover designer is in Raleigh, North Carolina, or excuse me, Chapel Hill. So we're spread about. So through the miracle, largely of the internet, we connect and share work. But that was something that I think most people aren't aware of. And so there's no editorial roundtable where, Roy Thomas of Alter Ego and Mike Manley of Draw and John Cook of Comic Book Creator and yours truly of Back Issue. We don't sit around an editorial table with John Morrow and throw out ideas and see what sticks and compare notes. No, John pretty much gives us the opportunity to create our own visions for the magazine. And I think that even though occasionally there's some overlapping with our publications, I think we have each magazine has its own perspective and voice. And sometimes that sort of mirrors the editors. But so I think that's one thing that's helped Tomorrow's have a diverse line where the magazines are complementary, but not necessarily competing or contradictory. So, but yeah, I work from my own home office, which is a blessing. I love it. Yeah. I don't have much of a commute. I come downstairs.
That's awesome. Well, was there any issue as you had to think back over 100 and you talked to Greenberger about it? Was there any issue of the 100 that you would like a do-over?
I'd like to do over the first few.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that with Bob too. The first one in particular, I had an estimated word count of how many words I could fit in the issue, and I followed it, but it was still much more open. Um, my challenge there was to just figure out what I was doing. I mean, I had worked in fanzines before getting into comics, and when I was at DC, I was the editor of the loose leaf version of Who's Who in the DC universe. So I was used to producing a periodical that was text driven. So I'm used to reading manuscripts and editing manuscripts. But nonetheless, I had not done anything quite like this before, and it took me a couple of issues to get a rhythm. I'm not embarrassed by the early issues by any stretch. I just wish there were more in them. The design is open and airy, and the original designer for the magazine, who did a fabulous job too, he filled in some of the gaps with, say, gradated images in the background too. And so if I were to go back, I'd probably add for the first couple of issues, another 2 articles into the mix and just, condense the leading, the line space and cram a little more material in there.
Okay.
But still, overall, I'm happy with the way they look. And plus, the magazine was originally black and white. And then some years into it, we added a color section, a center section, and then we eventually went to full color. And then when we finally went to full color on a slicker paper stock, I really felt like it was a magazine more so than a fanzine. And I say that not in any way to denigrate a fanzine,
Sure.
but nonetheless, it just felt like a real magazine at that point. And so I'd go do over a couple of the first issues.
Well, I know you mentioned to me, and you mentioned in the interview with Greenberger, that you plan out far in advance. I think in the story you mentioned you planned out to issue 109. This was 100. You're probably further ahead than that.
A little bit,
now.
yeah.
How long can you keep going without starting to repeat yourself, or worrying that you're going to repeat yourself in some way in terms of themes and stories?
There are some issues, some series, and such concepts from the 70s and 80s that we've yet to cover. So there is some ground there, and now we're starting to inch into the 90s. And this is going to be the interesting thing with my core readership, who are the diehard Bronze Age people. That I've got for issue 102, which comes out in January, a Rob Liefeld Deadpool versus Cable cover, and it was teased on our back issue group, and largely was liked, but a few people hated it, and but a lot of people just don't like the 90s. They vehemently hate that decade, and that's when I was actually active in the business as an editor, so I lived it. And saw it, and that was the over testosterone era where everybody had leather and giant shoulder pads and gigantic weapons and such, and even Superman had the mullet, all this wild stuff that was going on, and a lot of it was inspired by Image, but these are valid historical stories, and we're going to be exploring some of that. So, but what I pledge to my longtime readers of back issue is even if we have something that seems a little more recent, like Deadpool on the cover, you'll still find stuff in the issue that is from your era. So that issue I was just describing, 102, is the Mercs, as in mercenaries and anti-heroes issue. And in addition to Cable and Deadpool, we start with Deathstroke, the Terminator, who came out of the pages of Marv Wolfman and George Perez as New Teen Titans. And then there's the Vigilante and Wild Dog. There's Taskmaster, who came out of Avengers and in the late 70s, even in early 80s. So we still have some material that's truly anchored in the Bronze Age, even though we're flirting with the 90s. And will I ever do a full-on all 90s issue? Maybe. There have been a number of people who have been requesting that we look at some of the universes that came up in the mid-90s, like the Ultraverse, Comics Greatest World from Dark Horse, that type of thing. And I do want to explore some of that. Even the
Malibu. Don't forget Malibu.
Malibu, yeah. And that would have been the Ultraverse, though, right?
Oh, is that the same thing?
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah, that's their universe. But
What do
and
I know? Just ignore me, folks.
That probably was the most successful, I think, just because Marvel, absorbed those characters later on. But I could then maybe even argue that maybe Dark Horses has had the most legs because Dark Horse has revived a handful of those characters, like Ghost in particular, off and on over the years. These characters keep coming back.
I like Stephen Grant's X, for the record.
Yeah.
That was really
good. I edited the first, 8, 9 issues of that. I think Stephen Grant, Doug Monkey.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I think Chris Warner was doing some of the covers for us back then. So, that was a powerful book. Yeah, I went from in the mid-'90s from DC out to Dark Horse, and they just started the superhero line. So, guess what I was editing coming from DC? But
that's so funny because I did not know that you did that, but I had Stephen Grant on Mr. Media 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay.
Just so I could talk to him about X.
Okay. When you dig out your issues, you'll notice that I have the editorial credit there. So, back then I was doing that stuff. Catalyst, Agents of Change, Barbed Wire, Ghost, The Machine. Those are there's some good books there.
There were some good books there. Yeah, I was very sorry that they didn't continue that universe. And sometimes I think they rush through things a little too quickly, but. Mike Richardson.
Speaking frenzy. Everybody was trying to get their universe out, and as this medium has shown us time and time again, and so has American capitalism. When there is a fad, when there is a trend, when everybody jumps on it, and when you have an explosion, there will be an implosion. It always happens, and we just can't seem to learn from this. But but again, the strong characters tend to be revived off and on, and their stories are told again.
True, very true. Well, listen, folks, you can buy single issues of Back Issue Magazine, or even better, subscribe by going to the publisher's website. That's twomorrows.com. It's not spelled like tomorrow. It's spelled like two morrows, TWOMORROWS.com. Back issue is generally right there on the front page, or you can see a link to it on the left, or you'll see a cover or something. They've got a wheel going at the moment. You can pull it up on the wheel.
It's like a wheel of fortune.
Exactly.
You spin it. You can spin it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anna's not there to show you what the new release is, though. Unfortunately,
that might be something for John to look into. More eyeballs. And before I forget, you can also find Michael Eury's new book, Hero A Go-Go, campy comic books, crime fighters, and I don't know why I have trouble saying this. And culture of the swinging 60s, wherever great books are sold, or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. It's somewhere on the page. If you're looking at Mr. Media, it's somewhere to the left or right underneath this interview. Is there any social media? Where can people find Back Issue? I'm thinking Facebook.
Well, yeah, we have a very active Facebook group, and so it is. We have probably some 8,000. People on it, and we had to be a little selective about the screening because at first we had all of the people from God knows what nation trying to sell sunglasses on the site, but we want people there to talk about comics of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So and we don't allow political discussions. If it's really just not on topic or close to topic, we nix it. John Trumbull, who was a cartoonist and writer, and a stand-up comedian, and a frequent contributor to Back Issue. He did the wonderful oral history of Batman the Animated Series in issue 99, which had that great Harley Quinn Bruce Timm cover. But John is the main moderator with me. But John does the lion's share of the heavy lifting there, watching to make sure people behave themselves. And most of them do. But we just try to avoid the hot button topics, too, because we want the Facebook group to be, like the magazine, is positive in tone. And that doesn't mean we avoid controversy, but I also don't want to pepper the field with landmines that people are going to detonate constantly, too. There is a minor Twitter presence, and that's left up to me. It's we're kind of mom and pops here, or just pops actually. And
Really?
and,
Comic books?
yeah.
Just just a bunch of guys, huh? Boy, that's going to just shock people.
Well, there you go. Yep. Surprise, surprise, surprise. But yeah, it's back issue. I mean, editorially is a staff of one. Design wise, a staff of two, and then we all work freelance. And so the social media presence is really there for people it's just there to engender camaraderie and the sharing of fun and ideas and history and nostalgia too. I mean, sometimes people will just post, like I noticed this past week, one guy's been posting a number of covers, first issue covers from the 70s. And, and it's like, it might spark a conversation, but if nothing, it just kind of brings a smile to your face to remember, well, I remember when I got that Logan's Run, with that great George Perez cover. And I love the movie, that kind of thing. And so here we go again. I should have turned it off earlier, but
that's all right.
0, 4, 7.
Shut up. My phone does talk. It tells me very loudly who's calling.
I hear that.
And now I'm trying my best to stifle it. If you see me squirming here, I'm actually sitting on my phone. And it's vibrating, and it's making me feel warm and fuzzy. I didn't realize I'd have this vicarious thrill through our conversation tonight, Bob.
It's interesting. We're over 1,300 interviews, in fact, and you were the first who said to sit on their phone. So, It's kind of like back issue. There's always room for something new to happen.
That is cool. I always love being the first, too.
Very good.
And, of course, my note to myself is the next time I do this, I will cut the darn phone off, as I should have. And I've done many times in the past, but sorry about that.
I'm sure you've amused more than a few people. Michael Eury, thank you personally for so much entertainment in this issue. I really enjoyed it. If you're a comic book fan and you're not already reading back issue, I really recommend you check it out, subscribe. And most of all, Michael, good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Media, today.
You're welcome, Bob. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of comic book fanzine publishers who still have mimeograph fluid in their veins and respiratory issues from living in their parents' basements all these years, in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida.
Hi, this is Rich Scheidner. If you've ever wondered what it was like to be a stand-up comedian in the 1980s, I'm going to do you a big favor. Instead of billions of dollars for a time machine, you can just spend $24.95 and buy my new book, Kicking Through the Ashes, My Life as a Stand-Up in the 1980s Comedy Boom. It will save you money and give you thrills. It will take you there. Go to my website, richscheidner.com, go to amazon.com, and buy this book.